Hello everyone, it's 7 o'clock. This is Sky News Breakfast. Now, you have to go a long way back to find a bigger election win for Labour than the one they achieved last night in Chester. But is it big enough for the party to be confident that they're on the road to power? We'll be discussing that throughout the programme. Plus, Transport Secretary Mark Harper will meet rail union bosses today, but there's no guarantee it'll help to stop the strikes. So we'll be live in Chester and live at the RMT headquarters. It's Friday, the 2nd of December.
I hereby declare that Samantha Kate Dixon has been duly elected as the Member of Parliament for the City of Chester.
A good night for Labour as they convincingly beat the Conservatives in the Chester by-election. Union officials say the Transport Secretary will meet the head of the RMT rail union today to try to prevent a series of nationwide strikes.
With strikes set to bring the rail network to a standstill over much of Christmas, commuters will be hoping that the government will be able to hammer out a deal with the RMT union to end the dispute.
A Ukraine official says between 10 and 13,000 of its soldiers have been killed so far in the war with Russia. On a day of shocks in Qatar, Germany and Belgium are both knocked out of the World Cup.
Well, good morning from the World Cup in Qatar. Germany are going home, knocked out of the group stages for the second tournament in a row.
The Royal Rift, the Prince and Princess of Wales, continue their US trip, battling against the high-profile publicity campaign launched by Harry and Meghan. Also, how to look good at this year's Christmas lunch. Mylene Klaas will tell us why she's a fan of Christmas jumpers. Hello, a very good morning to you. Labour has won the Chester by-election with the biggest swing from the Conservatives to Labour since 1997. Samantha Dixon retained the seat for her party with a 61% share of the vote. And it's the first public vote since Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were ousted from number 10. And Ms Dixon used her victory speech to warn that the Conservatives were on borrowed time.
I've just talked in my acceptance speech about the difficulty that people in Chester are experiencing in their lives day to day. And I think the voters feel very strongly about that. And I think that's probably the reason why we've seen such a significant increase in Labour's share.
So let's take a look at the breakdown of the result, with Labour winning by a majority of nearly 11,000 votes. Her Conservative rival, Liz Wardlaw, was in second place with 6,335. The Liberal Democrat's Rob Hurd was third, increasing the party vote share from the 2019 election. And the result represents a 13.8% swing from the Tories to Labour, the sixth largest between the parties at a by-election since 1945. The swing in Wakefield in June was 12.7%. Well, our political correspondent Liz Bates is in Chester for us this morning. So, Liz Bates, a healthy win then for Labour. Presumably they're pretty satisfied with this result.
Yeah, big win for Labour here in Chester. They are pretty happy about the results, sort of early Christmas present, if you like, for them. It's quite interesting as well in this seat because this is not, we are in the north, but this is not a red wall seat by any stretch of the imagination. This is much more like a sort of swing seat. It was traditionally Conservative. It went Labour in 1997, back to the Conservatives in 2020 and it's 2010 under David Cameron, and then it's been Labour ever since. Usually very small majorities, but this is their biggest majority here ever, almost 11,000 votes on percentage share as well. It's their highest result ever here, so they're really pleased with this. A 14% swing away from the Conservative Party, which will be worrying for them, of course. What it means for Labour is they've been doing extremely well in the polls, and they will have been wanting, particularly after the Wakefield by-election, to see that replicated again when it comes to voters turning out for them at the ballot box, because, of course, that's the only poll in the end that matters, and they've seen that happen today. Of course, if this was extrapolated across the country, it would see them in government, but this is, of course, just a by-election, and things are very different when it comes to a general election. election, but they will be feeling very confident and positive, thinking about the next general election in a couple of years' time. What it means for the Conservative Party, I mean, Rishi Sunak won't be happy with this result, but I think it probably won't be seen as a reflection of his premiership. He just simply hasn't been in long enough to have had much of an impact here. And of course, there was a lot of damage done when it came to Conservative support up and down the country during the final months of Boris Johnson's premiership, and then, of course, a sort of hemorrhaging, a collapse under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. What it does show Rishi Sunak is the level of challenge that he faces. This is the type of seat that if he wants to stay in government, remain Prime Minister, he should be competing for. Well, he's not competing very well here at the moment, and he will have to turn that round in the next couple of years against a very dismal economic backdrop if he wants to remain in government.
Liz, thanks very much indeed. So let's get a view on all of this. We can speak to the Conservative pollster, Lord Robert Hayward. A very good morning to you. Nice to see you. I mean, Labour were expected to win this by-election, weren't they? But what do you make of the result and how much they won it by? Have they got reason to really celebrate today?
Oh, yes, Labour have to be pleased. They've got over 60%, the swings 13%. It's good for cheer for the Labour Party, no question about it. But the Conservatives will be relieved. They got over 20%. There's a psychological thing there. And it's not quite as bad as the opinion polls have been suggesting. So pleasure on the Labour side, relief a bit on the Conservative side.
Well, yes, and you talk about what the national opinion polls are suggesting. If they were to match that, they would have had a 17% swing, Labour, from the Conservatives. So is that a source of disappointment? Would you expect them to match those national polls at this point?
Somewhere in the range. There's no question that the Conservatives will be relieved that it is below what one might have expected rather than above. But Labour quite reasonably can say, well, the turnout was only 41%, it was 70% at the last general election. So I think generally as expected, no shocks, but definite satisfaction for the Labour Party.
Well, yes, and not great for the Tories either. No. I mean, this is not something that's good news for Rishi Sunak to wake up to. He's pretty fresh in the job. How much of the blame should he take for this?
I think he'll take the view. He's been in the job for just over a month. He knows the challenges. The Tory party know the challenges. And to a large extent, the collapse of the Tories in the opinion polls arose from the events right through the summer into the autumn. And he will say, I've got to put it behind me, which is what the message has been over the last few weeks. Get on with the job, re-establish the economy, deal with the big issues, whether it's immigration or strikes or the NHS, and convince the government. The next big electoral hurdle will be a huge raft of local elections next May, and that's where the real attention will turn to.
I mean, some people say that at this stage in a prime ministership, that's not a word, but you know what I mean. When you've taken on the top job,
yes,
and it's so early on in that job, you might get a little bit of a boost. People might say, look, there's a fresh leader, let's give him a chance.
No, I think the sense has been that the Tories have had a very, very bad summer into the autumn. He's taken over in incredibly difficult circumstances. He knows what he wants to do. The question is whether he can actually do it. He's got a very, very slight bounce because the opinion polls, the Tories were in the bottom of a very deep barrel, and the opinion polls showed that the Tories have lifted themselves a bit off that. This result shows a bit better than the opinion polls are showing. So he might have had a slight bounce. He stopped the Tories just collapsing into irrelevance.
But how worried will those MPs in the Red Wall, the so-called Red Wall seats, not far from Chesterfield today?
Oh, it's not just the Red Wall. I sat in this studio a few weeks ago and said that, given the opinion polls, the Tories couldn't be clear that they'd got any safe seats. So it's not just Red Wall. All Tory MPs will be looking at this result. They'll be looking at local government by-elections, because they are those each week. And being concerned. There's no question about it. The Tories have got to make progress.
But what kind of progress can they make when we're heading into a winter of... So far, we've got lots of strikes planned, but we've also got this terrible cost of living crisis where bills are just going up and up. How can the Tories make any real headway before those local elections?
There's no question they have a real challenge on their hands. But having said that, Rishi comes across to the public at large as managerial. His ratings are way ahead of the Tory parties. His ratings, which will worry the Labour Party, are on a par with Keir Starmer, depending on which poll you actually look at. So he is showing that there is potential, but cost of living and strikes, clearly big issues. But the end of my road today, petrol prices down again at the local petrol station. So there are some indications that there are opportunities there for the Tory party, but Rishi has to convince the public at large that he can manage out of this crisis, whichever crisis one's looking at, and there's a lot of them.
And just a quick question, I'm curious to know what you make of the fact that Boris Johnson has said that he does intend to stand again next time round. The Tories have set this deadline, haven't they, for MPs to come forward and say whether or not they're going to stand again. We've seen some of the younger MPs deciding not to. Boris Johnson says he will. What do you think that does to the psyche of the party, knowing that the former leader still intends to stay on?
I think it probably says, I want to continue to serve, because you'd be asking me almost the opposite question if he'd announced that he was going to stand down. Isn't this a comment? So it's natural, I think, for Boris. Boris is a natural politician. He wants to be in the political world, and therefore I think it comes as no surprise that he's actually announced what he has, that he's going to stay on at Uxbridge.
OK, well, Lord Hayward, always interesting to get your take on it all. Thanks very much indeed. Now then, let's take a quick look at what's making the front pages of the morning papers. And The Express asks, Harry, do you really hate your family so much? The Mirror simply goes with a headline, Royal Crisis Deepens. The Eye warns that Royal Mail could struggle to cope with demand over Christmas following a backlog caused by strike action. The Guardian claims an exclusive with news that health union chiefs are meeting to plan joint strikes. Strikes lead the Times as well, with appeals from ministers to rail unions to call a truce in their industrial action. And the Daily Mail carries extracts from the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock's new book, in which he reveals a plan to release thousands of prisoners was under discussion at the height of the pandemic. So a look there at the front pages of the morning paper, strikes on some of them. And in fact, unions officials say that the leader of Britain's main rail union will meet the Transport Secretary later on today as part of efforts to try to prevent a series of nationwide strikes. Mick Lynch from the RMT will hold talks with Mark Harper after warnings that this dispute will cost the country billions of pounds in the run-up to Christmas. It's one of a series of disputes resulting in strikes every day in December. Other workers taking action include nurses, teachers and postal workers. Well, Sky's Milena Veselinovic joins me now from the RMT headquarters in central London. So, Milena, how much hope is there that these talks might produce some kind of breakthrough?
Well, Hugh Merriman, the rail minister, certainly hopes so. He has called on the union leaders to be altruistic and cancel these strikes which are taking place ahead of Christmas and in the new year. Traditionally, a time that's really important for the hospitality industry, places like pubs, restaurants, shops, hoping to make a lot of the Christmas trade and make up for the 2 very difficult years they've had during the pandemic. But I think it's important to note that the negotiations itself, they are not between the government and the unions. They're between the rail companies and the unions. The government said that they would be there to facilitate and support any deal, but not to negotiate on the deal itself. And when it comes to the impact on hospitality, well, the trade industry body, UK Hospitality, says that on strike days, it will cost them £1.5 billion. It's a devastating impact. And if these strikes do go ahead, they will be the largest in 30 years. Huge economic impact, huge impact on commuters as well. Now, the unions are placing the blame on the government, saying that they actually managed to find deals with devolved government administrations in Scotland and in Wales, but there was no such help from Westminster. They're saying that the government is showing a lack of urgency, considering that these strikes are set to start in just a couple of weeks, and rail companies are actually saying if there's no solution in the next few days, it will be really hard to reinstate the timetable. So even if a deal was found later on in December, there would still be disruption and businesses would still suffer.
OK, Milena, and a fascinating one to watch, of course. Thanks very much indeed. An advisor to the Ukrainian President Zelensky says somewhere between 10 and 13,000 soldiers have been killed in the war against Russia. The figures from senior official Mikhailo Podolyak appears to be the first estimate of the dead since August. Last month, the US said they believed that more than 100,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded in Ukraine so far. Well, US President Biden says he's prepared to meet Vladimir Putin if the Russian president shows any interest in ending the war in Ukraine. He made the comments during a state visit by the French President Macron, where the war in Ukraine has dominated talks. During a joint press conference after their meeting, President Biden said he would talk to the Russian president if he showed willingness to end the war, but that is yet to happen.
I have no immediate plans to contact Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin is, let me choose my words very carefully. I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet. If that's the case, in consultation with my French and my NATO friends, I'll be happy to sit down with Putin to see what he has in mind.
Let me tell you is that we will never urge the Ukrainians to make a compromise which will not be acceptable for them, because they are so brave and they defend precisely their lives, their nation, and our principles, and because it will never build a sustainable peace. If we want a sustainable peace, we have to respect the Ukrainians to decide the moment and the conditions in which they will negotiate about their territory and their future.
Guys, Alistair Bunkle is in Doha for us this morning. Alistair, what a night of football that was.
Oh, it really was. I mean, this World Cup is not failing to disappoint on the pitch much of the time, particularly as we're getting into the nitty-gritty of what are effectively knockout matches for many of them. The last round of group games is seeing some pretty frenetic football as teams try and scramble for the top two places in a group in order to progress. Not so for Germany. It was a very strange match. They took the lead early on and they looked by far and away the dominant side against Costa Rica. And then early in the second half, Costa Rica scored twice to go in front. But it wasn't just what was happening at that match, it was what was happening as well against Japan versus Spain. And a similar thing happened. Spain went in the lead and then Japan got two quick goals to take that lead over. And for a few minutes, it looked as though both Germany and Spain were going to go home. Japan held on for that victory, a 2-1 victory over Spain. That means they topped the group. Germany then found some goals in them and they managed to quite convincingly beat Costa Rica. But it wasn't enough. They finished bottom of the group, and for the second tournament in a row, they're going home. Normally such a dependable World Cup team, 4 times World Cup winners, the scourge of many an England side in tournaments going back through the decades, but not to be this time. They are leaving Qatar early, and instead it is Japan and Spain who progress in that group to the next round.
Many twists and turns, Ali. What's next? Thanks very much indeed. Still to come here on the show. At 7:30, we're going to be joined by the Director of Policy at National Energy Action, as well as a mother struggling to pay her bills, as new figures reveal that millions of households will be in fuel poverty by April. And why isn't the UK in a better position to deal with another pandemic? I'll be speaking to Clive Dix, who's a former chair of the UK Vaccine Task Force. But right now, let's take a look at some of the day's other headlines. And 2 teenagers have been charged with the murders of 16-year-olds Kian Solanke and Charlie Bartolo in southeast London. Kian Solanke was stabbed in Thamesmead and Charlie Bartolo was found a mile away in Abbey Wood on Saturday. Family members of the victims of a hospital worker who abused more than 100 corpses could receive tens of thousands of pounds in compensation. David Fuller was handed a life sentence last year for the murders of 2 women in Tunbridge Wells in 1987. He also pleaded guilty to sexual offences against 101 deceased females in a hospital mortuary. The cost to the Metropolitan Police of dealing with recent environmental protests is more than £5.5 million. Met Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley gave the figures during a meeting with the Prime Minister and Home Secretary, called to discuss how to deal with demonstrations by the group Just Stop Oil. The US Congress has passed emergency legislation stopping railway workers from going on strike. The Senate approved a bill binding workers and rail companies to a proposed settlement. NHS officials have warned mental health services in England are being left to fail. The NHS Confederation and Centre for Mental Health says many patients often only get the help they need when they're in crisis. Football legend Pelé has posted on social media for the first time since going back into hospital. The former Brazil striker thanked fans and players who sent him messages of support from the World Cup in Qatar. Scientists say they believe an asteroid may have created a so-called mega tsunami across the surface of Mars billions of years ago. Researchers at the Planetary Science Institute in the United States say a giant wave measuring up to 250 metres in height caused a crater on the planet's surface more than 100 kilometres wide. Now, the Prince and Princess of Wales will finish their visit to the United States today after a trip which has been overshadowed by allegations of racism in Buckingham Palace. There was also controversy when Netflix released the first images from a new documentary about the life of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex midway through the royal tour. Our royal correspondent Laura Bundock reports now from Boston.
They're soldiering on, but there's no escaping the Buckingham Palace racism row. Day 2 in Boston also overshadowed. The Prince and Princess of Wales want to be heard, but it's hard. A warm welcome, though, at this community project.
The energy was good. I didn't feel any negative vibes. As far, it definitely shows that they, are not what the media probably shows about them, as far as the bad light. And yeah, so, as far as me thinking that they're racist, I wouldn't say that.
This was their day to champion causes they care about, but it was also the day Harry and Meghan dropped this.
Why did you want to make this documentary?
The trailer to their much-hyped Netflix series.
I had to do everything I could to protect my family.
When the stakes are this high, doesn't it make more sense to hear our story from us?
These short sentences say so much. Harry and Meghan on the warpath and another torpedo for the Wales' trip. They're outwardly enjoying themselves, but you can only imagine what they're thinking.
And then for the trailer to come out, that's to me is backstabbing. Let everyone have their moment. And Catherine and William right now, the Prince and Princess of Wales, have their moment here in Boston to make a change for the better. And that's where they should stand.
We got to work together. We got to unite and stay together. Doesn't matter the black, white, Spanish, doesn't matter. We all got to work together and unite.
You worried that the royal family are racist?
No, absolutely not.
This whole visit is being eclipsed by other events. Interestingly, the racism row isn't really resonating here, but people are fascinated by the royal family, mostly, though, the dynamics and the dramas. And the Prince and Princess of Wales probably wishing there was a lot less of both. Laura Bundock, Sky News in Boston.
Let's take a look at what the weather's doing there. Well, this year brought the third warmest autumn on record, but it's a cold start to the meteorological winter. It's murky and chilly for many now, with some dense fog around, mainly across southwest Britain. And it'll stay rather grey through the morning, with fog slowly lifting, but there'll be some sunshine around. Ireland, Northern Ireland, West Wales and Cornwall look most favoured. Northern parts will have some patchy light rain, mainly southern and eastern Scotland, while East Anglia and the southeast will be at risk of showers. Welcome back. Let's remind you of our top stories here this morning. A good night for Labour as they convincingly beat the Conservatives in the Chester by-election. Union officials say the Transport Secretary will meet the head of the RMT rail union today to try to prevent a series of nationwide strikes. And a Ukrainian official says between 10 and 13,000 of its soldiers have been killed so far in the war with Russia. So Labour has won the Chester by-election with the biggest swing from the Conservatives to Labour since 1997. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the Conservative pollster Lord Robert Hayward and asked him if Labour have reason to celebrate after their by-election victory last night.
Labour have to be pleased. They've got over 60%, the swing's 13%. It's good for cheer for the Labour Party, no question about it. But the Conservatives will be relieved. They got over 20%. There's a psychological thing there. And it's not quite as bad as the opinion polls have been suggesting. So pleasure on the Labour side, relief a bit on the Conservative side.
Well, our political correspondent, Amanda Akers, is here with me. Morning to you. So where does this result leave the Tories, Amanda?
Well, I think it's interesting what Lord Hayward was saying there, really. I think for some in the Conservative Party, given the scandals of Boris Johnson's administration, the divisive leadership campaign over the summer, disaster of the mini-budget, now all the bad economic news with the autumn statement, the cost of living crisis, many would have feared it could have been even worse, particularly given the national polling is showing Labour 17%, even 25% ahead of the Tories. Governing parties do traditionally lose by-elections. Equally, it's not good for morale. Potentially, we're going to see many more of these coming down the track, especially as Boris Johnson's looking to, in his resignation honours list, elevate some of his MPs to the Lords. For Rishi Sunak, he's only been in office as Prime Minister sort of 6 weeks or so. It doesn't really give the impression of a government in control with this wave of strike actions we're seeing in the run-up to Christmas. Later today, there's a meeting between the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, and Mick Lynch of the RMT. Second meeting, they had one last week, which was described as quite positive. Yesterday, Eddie Dempsey of the RMT told Kay Burley that he was hopeful a deal could potentially be struck. He talked quite warmly almost about the kind of change in tone under the new administration, certainly a bit more pragmatic. Yesterday in the House of Commons, Hugh Merriman, the rail minister, was talking about the impact on small businesses, calling on the unions to be altruistic, call off the strikes in the run-up to Christmas, potentially UK hospitality, warning of an impact of around £1.5 billion lost to the industry because of all these strikes, particularly after all the impact of COVID we've seen in the last few years, and suggesting that the government would see what it could do to help as well. Not such a conciliatory tone coming from the Department of Health, though, in terms of the NHS strikes. Suggestions we could see some coordinated action across the board there. Government, Prime Minister yesterday, Health Secretary insisting their demands are unaffordable. The 19% increase that the nurses, for example, are calling for would cost £10 billion a year, saying that's not something we can do. Equally, we know long waiting lists in the NHS, 7 million people waiting for treatment. Ambulances yesterday in some areas taking an hour and 40 minutes to get to people. I think the more we see stories coming out about how this is affecting people, lives potentially lost, yes, potentially that's going to lead to more anger against the unions. But I think fundamentally the government will really need to look like they have a plan to stop this and bringing the country down.
Lots of pressures there. Yeah. Amanda, thanks very much indeed. Now, 8 months on from Russia's invasion, and people across Ukraine are learning to cope with the unpredictability of war. Some have compared their experience to London during the Blitz in the Second World War and say they share the same spirit of defiance. Well, Sky's security and defence editor Deborah Hain sent this report from Kiev.
Life goes on in Kyiv, with hungry mouths to feed. It almost looks ordinary. But everyone here knows another wave of Russian missile strikes could come at any moment, targeting energy supplies and turning off the power. Yet no one runs away. This couple have stayed in the capital since the first day of the full-scale war.
І ми не боїмося. Як буде, так буде. Але ми за свободу, за те, щоб наша країна перемогла. І тільки так.
І нам нема куди діватися. Ми в своїй країні, ми ж у своїй країні.
Many liken their resilience to what the UK endured during the Blitz in World War II.
Думаємо, що вони, якщо вони вижили після такого бомбардування, то ми теж виживемо.
Kyiv has been enjoying a lull in Russian attacks this week after waves of strikes caused widespread blackouts. The chances are it won't last, but no one's panicking. This was the response to an air raid warning at a forum where the mayor was due to speak.
Kyiv is under the air raid alert, but we are on the ground, we are in the shelter, and we will continue our work.
Vitaly Klitschko urged residents to be prepared for anything, even long periods without power.
The Russians try to bring depression of citizens instead them. I talked to our citizens, they are very angry and ready to stay and ready to fight.
It's a sentiment held by even the most frail. A determination to defy the dangers and dig in. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Kyiv.
Now, new figures reveal that 8.4 million UK households will be in fuel poverty by next April. That's up from 4.5 million last October. The charity National Energy Action says those in fuel poverty will include 6.3 million people with a disability and 1.8 million carers. Well, joining me now to discuss all of this is Peter Smith, the Director of Policy at National Energy Action. And I'm also joined by Charmaine, who's a mother of 8 who's struggling to pay her energy bills. And we're respecting her privacy, so we're hearing her voice rather than seeing her on screen. So welcome to both of you. Charmaine, to you first of all. We're hearing about millions of households being in debt because of energy bills. Give us a sense of how you're managing and how you've found trying to pay your own.
So it's been really hard. As you said, I'm a mother of 8, and the other day I had to top up £90 on my gas and electric just to get me above the emergency, just so I had something in my house. I'm having to cut back on wash loads. I'm having to cut back on my shopping, petrol. I'm having to cut back on everything, which is minimising what I can do for the children and with the children. I've got a birthday coming up, I've got Christmas, and I'm just scrimping and scraping, trying to find some extra money to help with that, because all the extra money that would have gone to that is now going to my energy bills.
And Peter, listening to Charmaine there, there'll be a lot of people seeing a familiar picture that they'll be suffering in the same kind of way across the country today, won't there? And at National Energy Action, where you are from, of course, you're saying that there are going to be millions more facing problems by next April. Just how bad do you think this could get?
Well, sadly, we know that there's far too many households, about 6.7 million UK households at the moment, that are facing the challenges that Charmaine was just highlighting. We know that that's going to jump up to over 8 million households from April, when the government reduces the support that it's making available to households to manage their energy costs. And it's a terrible situation. There's nothing more to cut back on. People have already been incredibly frugal, and really the only choices that they face are either to cut back entirely to the detriment of their health and well-being, or get into further debt. So it's a terrible situation, which doesn't seem like it's going to improve in the short term.
Well, yes, and Peter, the government has said it's going to scale back its energy support scheme in April, as you say, to make it more targeted. So what would your message to them be to make sure that the most vulnerable people, people like Charmaine, who are finding it hard to pay their bills now, make sure they're protected?
Well, we know that the support that the government are going to be making available post-April isn't going to be sufficient to help the poorest and the most vulnerable people. Approximately 1/3 of all households that really need support aren't going to receive anything more than the £3,000 cap that the government is putting in place from April, and so they're going to see a huge increase in their energy bills. This is at a time where energy prices are already at record highs. So we would like to see the government recognise that this winter is going to be tougher than they imagined and provide more support even in the remaining months of this winter. And then post-April, they need to provide more targeted support, particularly for those households that aren't on means-tested benefits. We're really concerned that low-income households that aren't on means-tested benefits will not be adequately protected post-April.
And Charmaine, when the changes to the energy support package come in April, how worried are you that you might have even less help? And what would that do to you if that was the case?
I do have a partner who works, but I do also receive benefits because he's on a low income. I have 2 children that I receive disability for, one of which has been diagnosed with autism, ADHD, speech and language, and dyslexia. So it's hard because I have to have, and she's got a hole in her heart as well, so my house has to be warm. I can't not have the heating on. So I'm scared that my daughter's going to end up getting really sick all the time. It's bad enough that they've taken a lot of time off school at the moment because they're getting sickness. They've got the runny noses, the coughs, the colds, the flu, because the house isn't as warm as it needs to be because I just can't afford to do it. And if I'm like this now, what am I going to be like when all of this all happens and we haven't got that little bit of help? Even though we get the £66 a month, that doesn't even last a week anymore. It goes as quick as it comes.
And Peter, I know you've helped a lot of families like Charmaine's in recent weeks with their energy bills. What kind of pressures do you as a charity feel under at the moment?
Well, overall, we're seeing an absolute surge in demand for the types of support that we can provide as a relatively small charity. We've seen about 180% increase in the amount of people coming to us compared to last year. Unfortunately, it is placing huge strain on our staff. Often hearing, stories like Charmaine's, but even more grim situations where people don't feel that they're able to adequately help and support people, and particularly give them the depth of support that they know is desperately necessary. So it is placing huge strain on not just our organisation, but organisations across the country. Today on our Fuel Poverty Awareness Day, we are celebrating the work of those organisations right across the country that are doing so much to try and stem the flood, but really we do need to see more support from national government if we're going to weather the worst of this crisis.
Well, Peter Smith from National Energy Action, thanks very much indeed for your time, and thanks to Charmaine. Thanks so much for joining us and telling us a little bit about your experience at the moment.
Thank you.
Though, the mother of a 14-year-old boy who was stopped by police says they left him traumatised. Janet Joseph told Sky News that the teenager's education had been affected. He no longer wanted to play football with his friends, and he now distrusts officers. Well, that view is apparently widely shared. A new report has found that just 36% of black children and teenagers have trust in the police. Our correspondent, Shaman Freeman-Powell, reports.
He's a young boy, bro.
You may be wondering what the child in this video did to deserve this.
Young boy. Hey, bro, how old is he? How old is he? I don't know. That's aggressive, man.
But 14-year-old Deshaun was simply walking home from school. Police here explained to a member of public that he was stopped, searched and pinned to the ground because he matched the description of a knife-wielding robber.
Deshaun was in his school uniform, and the only description that matched was the colour of Deshaun's skin. They just snatched his mobile phone from him. They then proceeded to push him against the railings and handcuff him.
The way the incident was conducted is now under investigation, but Deshaun's mum says it won't change the lasting impact it's had on her son.
Deshaun's education has been massively affected by this. We've had to organise transport to get him back and forth from school. He no longer goes out with his friends anymore. And of course, there's a big distrust.
The Met Police say that stop and search is a crucial tool in helping to reduce crime, but that it doesn't underestimate the impact it can have on young people, recognising the importance of using the tool with dignity and respect. But that's not enough for Janet. She's petitioning for a change in law which would see the police adopt a child-centred approach to these scenarios. The bill would support stop and search as long as it's done the right way. Jaden is sympathetic to police. He understands that they have a job to do. But at just 15 years old, he's been stopped 3 times already.
To be honest, the situation I did have was a bit humiliating because at the same time there was people coming out of school, parents around, kids, adults, and it was just a bit embarrassing.
A child's first encounter with police is vitally important because it will shape the way they view them for the rest of their lives. But a new report by an independent think tank has found that when it comes to black children, the level of trust in police is alarmingly low. 73% of young people trusted the police, but only 36% of black children trust the police. And whilst 87% of white children would call the police if they believed they were in danger, only 56% of black Caribbean children would call police. I put these findings to Deputy Chief Constable Tyrone Joyce. He's developing a plan of action to tackle some of these issues.
As a dad, I feel a sense of shame. As a police officer, I feel a sense of shame. Because every member of the community needs to feel protected. The only thing that I would say in this plan is there is concrete activity to demonstrate that we're being fair, to demonstrate proportionality, to give that level of reassurance.
But before building the foundations of trust, the police may first have to confront and repair the mistakes of the past. Shimon Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
Let's take a look now at some of the day's other headlines. And the President of South Africa is facing calls to resign after he was accused of corruption. A report examining claims Cyril Ramaphosa covered up the theft of more than £3 million in cash from his farm described the President's explanations as improbable. An Australian man who became the subject of a popular crime podcast has been jailed for 24 years for his wife's murder. 74-year-old Chris Dawson was convicted in August after decades of speculation about Lynette Dawson's 1982 disappearance. A judge ruled Dawson killed his wife so he could continue his relationship with his teenage lover and babysitter. We're going to check on the weather now. Well, this year brought the 3rd warmest autumn on record, but it's a cold start to the meteorological winter. It's murky and chilly for many now, with some dense fog around, mainly across southwest Britain. And it'll stay rather grey through the morning, with fog slowly lifting, but there will be some sunshine around.